Let's go on a tour of the mammalian brain. When we look at parts of the brain, it's best to start at the bottom and work our way up. The bottom of the brain, the brainstem, or the hindbrain, contains the oldest parts of the brain from an evolutionary standpoint. It includes the top of the spinal cord, the medulla, the pons, the reticular formation, and the cerebellum. These primitive structures of the brain deal with the most basic functions that a brain could be in charge of. It is in this part of the brain that we are most similar to other vertebrates. Let's start with the spinal cord. The spinal cord is the main highway of information between the body and the brain. It's a thick bundle of nerve fibers that allows the brain and the body to communicate. Now let's move up to the medulla. The medulla controls autonomic functions responsible for maintaining vital bodily functions, such as breathing and heartbeat. It basically serves as the life support system for the body. As we move further north, we see the pons. The pons is involved in motor control and sensory analysis. It has parts that are important for levels of consciousness and for sleep. Some structures in the pons are connected to the cerebellum and therefore play a role in movement and posture. Just dorsal to the pons, we see a net-like set of nerve fibers called the reticular formation. The reticular formation plays a role in arousal, attention, cardiac reflexes, motor functions. It regulates our awareness. Then we move to the rounded structure in the back of the hindbrain called the cerebellum. The cerebellum is associated with the regulation and coordination of complex muscle movement, posture, and balance. Think of a muscle movement as complex as maybe a golf swing, and all the different muscles that have to be involved in a golf swing. If each of those muscles was working out of sync, you would not get the smooth, continuous motion. But the function of the cerebellum coordinates those different muscle actions into one nice, smooth movement. Now we'll move up into the middle sections of the brain, or the midbrain. The structures here are difficult to make out because they're layered upon each other, and we are looking at a cross-section, two-dimensional picture. We will start in the very center of the brain with the thalamus. The thalamus is responsible for routing sensory information coming into the brain to the correct location in the upper parts of the brain for interpretation. It's like when a call comes into school. The front desk will connect that call to whichever part of the school the person intends to talk to. Maybe it's the college counseling office or the athletic department. My visual image of the thalamus is that of a switchboard operator. The thalamus also transmits replies from the upper parts of the brain to the cerebellum and medulla for outgoing information. Just below the thalamus is the hypothalamus. Hypo means below, so we're below the thalamus. The mental image I have for the hypothalamus is that of Homer Simpson's workplace. Homer's job at the nuclear power plant is to monitor all of the plant's systems and make sure nothing is in the danger zone. He sits in front of a wall of dials that looks like this. As long as the levels are in the green, not too high, not too low, then things are okay. But if something is out of whack, out of balance, out of homeostasis, then the hypothalamus would send a signal to make adjustments. The hypothalamus monitors your body's conditions. It regulates things like hunger, thirst, as well as autonomic functions. Attached to the bottom of the hypothalamus is the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland is also known as the master gland. It produces and releases many hormones that target other endocrine glands and causes them to release their hormones. These hormones help regulate homeostatic control. What we don't see in this view are two other important midbrain structures that are part of what is called the limbic system. I'm talking about the amygdala and the hippocampus. The amygdala is part of the brain that plays a role in emotions such as fear and seems to play a role in the processing of memory. The hippocampus is an important part of the brain for learning and memory. It seems to help move things from our short-term memory into our long-term memory. It also seems to help us recall spatial relationships. There's one more important part to mention before moving on to the cerebrum, and that's the corpus callosum. The corpus callosum is the main bridge of nerve fibers that connects the right and left hemispheres of the cerebrum to each other. Now we're going to move to the upper portion of the brain, the cerebrum, also known as the cerebral cortex. This is the part of the brain that truly separates mammals from other vertebrates, primates from other mammals, and man from other primates. This is where we think, understand, relate, integrate, process, and learn. This is where we make decisions. The cerebrum is divided into four distinct lobes: the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe, and the temporal lobe. You will need to be able to label and give the functions of each. The frontal lobe. The frontal lobe is the executive decision-making center. Also, elements of our personality seem to reside in the frontal lobe. In addition, large portions of the frontal lobe are dedicated to motor association, and the very last ridge of the frontal lobe is the primary motor cortex. That is where we exert conscious control over moving our muscles. The parietal lobe. At the very front ridge of the parietal lobe is our primary sensory cortex. It is where we receive sensory information from our body. Behind that are large areas dedicated to sensory association. The occipital lobe at the back of the brain is primarily responsible for visual processing and visual association. And the temporal lobes along the side of the cerebrum are for auditory processing and auditory association. Also, on the left side of the temporal lobe, we have specialized centers for language, and on the right side, we have areas specialized for spatial relationships. Here, we see a color-coded diagram showing more specific functions and where they occur within each lobe. Pay special attention to the location of the motor cortex and the sensory cortex, as you will have to identify these. We now have a good start to be able to identify and give the functions of certain brain structures and regions. Here are all the parts you'll need to be responsible for.